back. So now that we've done some background information on the bone histology, it's time to get into the anatomy of bones. And this is not going to be the anatomy of like the skeleton. I have other videos on there on my playlist, anatomy skeleton, but this is going to be the anatomy of like one single actual bone all the way down to the microscopic level. But we'll start at the macroscopic level. And on any bone, the layers of any bone has three components. We have the compact bone, we have the spongy bone, and we have articular cartilage. Now, compact bone is just what it sounds like. It's very compact and hard, and it's the outer surface, or it's the outer layer of all bones. Spongy bone is also called cancellous bone. And it really is like the consistency of a sponge. And we'll see some microscopic images of it pretty soon. They're pretty trippy. If you have trypophobia, here's a trigger warning for you because it's pretty weird to look at. But the spongy bone is cancellous bone, and that is in the inside of the bone. And the reason why we have spongy bone, or one of the reasons why we have spongy bone, is because it's more hollow. Like compact bone is just that, it's compact. But spongy bone is very hollow, so that makes the bone lighter. If we did not have spongy bone on the insides of our bones, we would all be like 300 pounds heavier than what we are right now, and we would need a lot more muscle mass to move around. So the spongy bone inside of the bone makes all of our bones much lighter. Articular cartilage, this is a hyaline cartilage. You should be familiar with that term, hyaline cartilage. We went over it in our last video, and there's a lot more stuff about hyaline cartilage and its relationship with bones that we'll get into. But articular, this just means articulating, and articulating just means to join together. So pretty much what that means is that the ends of the bone, wherever the bone is going to, here let me draw a little generic bone, the ends of the bone are going to connect with another bone, right, and form a joint. And so we don't want this just rough, hard bone rubbing up against another bone, because that would be really painful. So hyaline cartilage, or the articulating cartilage, is cartilage that just covers the ends of the bones where they meet up with other bones. So it provides sort of like a padding or a cushion. And the hyaline cartilage, the articular cartilage, is on both ends of the bones. That provides sort of a cushiony support in between the bones where the bones connect, so you're not rubbing bone on bone. When you get older, a lot of times, if you are an avid jogger, you know, you go running, a lot of times your knees, the articulating cartilage in your knees wear down, and that causes a lot of pain, and you have to get knee surgery. That also happens in your hip bone, when you get a lot older, you can wear down your articular cartilage or your hyaline cartilage on the head of the femur. And so where the femur fits into the hip, that articular cartilage wears down and it causes a lot of pain, and it causes you to have to get a hip replacement surgery when you're older. So articular cartilage, or made of hyaline cartilage, is very important, even though it's just a little bit at the ends of these bones. Now the erosion, as I was just saying, the erosion of the articulating cartilage, especially when you get older, that is called osteoarthritis. Because arthur means joint, so it happens in your joints, and osteo obviously means bone. So it's a condition of the bones at the joints. So osteoarthritis is the erosion of that hyaline cartilage wearing down, and so all of a sudden you don't have that and you just have bone rubbing on bone. It's very painful. Now, I went over this in the last video, but just to refresh really quickly, if you classify bones by their shape, there's different shapes to the bones. There are long bones, which just means just that. It just means they're longer than they are wide. So no mysterious technical term there. It just means they're long. These are usually your arms and your legs. There are short bones, and these are more cube-like bones, and you can find them in your wrists and ankles. There are flat bones, which means they're thin and slightly curved usually. So that would be your ribs, your sternum, and even your shoulder blades, your scapula. Then there are the irregular bones, and that is just what it means. They're irregular shaped. So like your vertebra, each individual vertebrae bones are irregularly shaped. Your hip bones, which is your pelvis, that's a crazy shape. I'll see you when you come into the bone room and start memorizing your skeleton, and you'll see what I mean. You'll be able to see the pelvis in person. And then also there are sesamoid bones. That always makes me think of sesame seeds on a hamburger bun. But sesamoid bones are irregular bones inside a tendon. Now, what's a tendon? So there are ligaments and tendons. And ligaments attach bone to bone. Tendons, however, attach bone to muscle. And tendons are actually a part of your musculature. And you'll learn more about that when you study the muscles. But a sesamoid bone is a bone inside of a tendon that's a muscular-like structure connecting a bone to a muscle. So an example of this would be your patella, which is your kneecap, and your pisiform bones, which are bones in your wrist. Not all the bones in your wrist. There's just one specific bone in your wrist that is named the pisiform bone, and that is inside of a tendon in your hand, and that would be considered a sesamoid bone. Also, we went over sutural bones, which is when you have, and you'll see this on the skull, it looks like seams, like somebody sewed pieces of bone together. Like here's your forehead, and then here's the back part, and then here's your temporal bone, and then here's your facial bone. This is a terrible drawing of a skull with a smiley face. So you'll see on the skull, you'll see these like seams, it looks like, and it divides the skull bones from each other, and those are called sutures. But sometimes when sutures form, instead of just like one line or one crack down the side of the skull, it will have the way it will have formed is these little tiny bones kind of can pop up sometimes and be part of inside the suture like that, and those are called sutural bones. And there really isn't there's not much on tests about sutural bones, but I wanted to include that to give you the complete list of how you classify bones by shape. Now I'm going to get into the actual anatomy, the macroanatomy of bones, and we're going to use the long bone as the example because most studies about bones and most test questions about bones are going to be about your long bones. And again, those are the bones in your arms and your legs. So let's get into the anatomy of a long bone. Now, as I had just said before, there's three major components to any bone, not just long bones, but there's the articular cartilage, and that is made up of hyaline cartilage. There is the compact bone, and there is the spongy bone. The articular cartilage is at the ends of the bone. The compact bone is on the outside, and the spongy is on the inside of the bone. Now if we look at just a generic long bone, I'm just going to draw this generic long bone. This really isn't anything. It looks more like a dog biscuit than anything else, but you get the idea. So there's this long bone, and what we're going to find wrapped around the outside of the bone, like kind of like the candy wrapper outside of the bone, is called the periosteum, and that is a membrane that wraps around the outside. Periosteum. Now the periosteum has two layers, so it's like 2-ply toilet paper. You know, you get the toilet paper off the roll and it looks like one sheet of toilet paper, but if it's 2-ply, you could actually tear those two sheets apart and get two really thin squares of toilet paper. So this is 2 layers. So the outer layer is called the outer fibrous layer. The inner layer is called the inner osteogenic layer. And again, those are two layers that are kind of glued together, and together they make this one sheet called the periosteum that wraps around the outside of the bone. Now, if you go to tear that periosteum off, if you were to rip it off, and you would have this bone underneath it, what you would end up seeing is all, like this Velcro kind of material from the periosteum. So if we were to tear this off, I'm just going to make this down like that. And this is going all the way around the bone, by the way, 360 degrees. And it's coming back over on this side. But say I tore that off, so it's not covering that section of the bone anymore. So I took that blanket off. Attached to this periosteum are these little tiny, like Velcro like things that start at the outer fibrous layer, and they penetrate and go through the inner osteogenic layer, and they come inside toward the bone, and they stick to the bone. And it's like I said, it's like Velcro. These little fibers stick out, and that is what attaches the periosteum to the outside of the bone. And these fibers are called Sharpie's fibers. And I'll put Velcro here, just so you know. So the Sharpie's fibers kind of Velcro the periosteum to the bone, so it's attached. So here is my drawing of a generic long bone, and as you can see, I tore the periosteum off of the bone. I tore it off and away, so usually this would wrap all the way around the bone, but I tore it off and away so you can see underneath the bone. And here's the Sharpie's fibers, those purple things, that's the Velcro that Velcros it to the surface of the bone. And let's do like an x-ray, take an x-ray look inside of this bone. If we were to look inside of this bone, in this shaft, which this whole length of the bone is called the shaft, we would see inside that there would be a layer of compact bone on the outside, circumference of the bone. And again, this wraps all the way around the bone, but I'm just showing you like a cutaway version here. So this would be the compact bone on the outside, because the compact bone is the hard stuff. So we want the hard stuff on the outside for protection. Now inside the compact bone, after you get through the layers of the compact bone to like the inner sanctum of the bone shaft, way in the middle, then you have a type of spongy bone. And it forms this kind of like weird labyrinth matrix in here. And the spongy bone actually goes away as you age and as the bone matures. But what's left is this cavity with these labyrinth, messy looking layers inside of here, these hollow layers. And this is called the medullary cavity. And I'll label this just so we don't forget. This is compact bone on the outside. Or you can also, you might also hear about it as the cortex of the bone. But the inside is the medullary cavity. Now, lining that medullary cavity, just like, you know how the periosteum is the external liner, and I call it like the candy wrapper because it wraps around the external surface of the bone. Well, inside the medullary cavity, after you get through the compact bone, inside that medullary cavity, lining the walls of that medullary cavity, is called the endosteum. So that's endosteum. So the liner on the outside is the periosteum, because peri means around, so around the outside, and inside, lining the inside of the compact bone, lining the medullary cavity. Endo means inside, and so this is the inside liner. And again, on the ends of this bone, of any bone, on the ends of these bones, right where it's going to connect up with another bone, on both ends, the bottom and the top here, this is articular cartilage, or you can also say articulating cartilage. And what type of cartilage makes this articular cartilage? Hyaline. Hyaline is the type of cartilage that makes up this articulating cartilage. And remember, this is the stuff where if it wears down, you can get osteoarthritis. So here's my long bone again, and we went through the inside of the bone with the outer cortex of the compact bone, and then the inside is the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is lined by the endosteum, and the entire bone outside of the bone is wrapped up in periosteum. So now let's look at just the basic structures and anatomical features of the bone from the outside. So obviously this is the long part, this section of the bone, and this would be called the shaft. And the shaft for bones is called the diaphysis. So this whole thing would be the diaphysis. Now, what about the ends? So the ends are going to be this whole section up here. And these ends are called the epiphysis, or one is called the epiphysis. And then another one down here is called the epiphysis. Plural, both of them together, is called the epiphyses. And you just change the I to an E at the end of the word to make it plural. So this is more than one. Now, in between the shaft, the diaphysis, And the epiphyses of the bone, there is like a little neck area here. There's one up here and there's one down here where the ends of the bone meet the shaft or meet the diaphysis, and these are called the metaphyses. So the long shaft is the diaphysis, the end of the bone is the epiphysis, and the neck of the bone is the metaphysis. And then don't forget about the hyaline cartilage, or the articulating cartilage, that covers the ends of the outside of the ends of these bones so they don't rub up against other bones and cause discomfort. I put hyaline cartilage, but it's called articular cartilage, and it's made up of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline is the name of the type of cartilage, and just the cartilage at the ends of these bones are specifically called articular cartilage, or articulating cartilage. Now, one more thing about a whole bone. Somewhere in the diaphysis, usually in the diaphysis, in the shaft, there is just a little bitty hole, and that is where an artery comes through, or blood vessels come through. An artery comes through there. Let's get a vein coming through there. And let's also put a nerve fiber running along with it through there. And these all go into this hole and inside into the medullary cavity in here, and they bring all the nutrients and they take away all the waste. So this is how a bone, I guess, eats and breathes, so to speak. So this hole where these vessels come in, go into the bone, is called the nutrient foramen. Nutrient because it delivers nutrients to the bone cells, and foramen because, if you don't know by now, a foramen just means a hole. Okay? Now here's the same bone again, and I just wanted to zero in on a couple of things here. Inside here, this would be the medullary cavity. This is also called the marrow cavity. So it's the same thing, medullary or marrow cavity. And then this purple, this neck, and there's one down here too, this is the metaphysis. And in the medullary cavity, right here, the medullary cavity is surrounded by that compact bone that we were talking about, that wraps around, that's the outer layer of the bones. And it wraps around in layers. You can't really tell my layers from my drawing, but these are in layers that wrap all the way around the bone into the shaft, around the shaft. But inside of there is that medullary cavity, and it's called the marrow cavity because it has yellow bone marrow in it. Now, yellow bone marrow, it's yellow because it's fat. It's full of fat. Now, in the ends of these bones, there is, instead of compact bone and instead of a medullary cavity, there is what they call spongy bone. So spongy bone is all in the ends. And this is the stuff that it's kind of hollow, and it's literally in the shape of a sponge. It has those porous fibers in it, and it makes the bone lighter. But it also does something else very important, because the what is in the epiphysis, the ends of the bones, the spongy bone that's in the ends, this is where your red bone marrow is kept. So I'm gonna dot this with a whole bunch of red in here, and down here too. It's in both of the ends. And your red bone marrow is so important because your red bone marrow makes blood cells. And not just regular red blood cells like we're used to thinking about blood, but it makes red blood cells, and it also makes white blood cells. So white blood cells are the blood cells that is what is used in the immune system to combat illness and pathogens. So the white blood cells and the red blood cells are made in this red bone marrow. So the bone marrow plays a very important role other than just making the bone lighter. Now, one more thing, at the metaphysis, the purple necks that I have drawn on here between the shaft, the diaphysis, and the ends, the epiphyses, the metaphysis has inside of it what is called a plate, an epiphyseal plate. And you notice that the ends of these bones are called the epiphysis. And right where the ends of the bone stop and the shaft of the bone begins in this metaphysis, it's called the epiphyseal plate. So it's kind of like the epiphysis. It's a very similar word. But this plate is inside the metaphysis, and it has all the components needed for growth. And I don't mean growth as in your bones getting fatter. I mean growth as in your bones getting longer. And this will kind of seal over and turn into an epiphyseal line once you're over 25, or around about there. Once you're over about 25 years of age, the plate goes away. The epiphyseal plate is also called the growth plate. And so when you're younger and you're still developing and you're still getting taller and your bones are still lengthening, they lengthen from these plates. Now, if you remember, I had said in the previous video, there is two ways of bone growth. There are two basic ways that bones grow. They grow appositionally, appositional growth, and that's when the bones are repairing themselves for some reason, if you have a breakage or a fracture. Also when you're growing up, when your bones are getting fatter and wider. They grow from the outside. They just keep adding layers of compact bone around and around and around the shaft, the diaphysis of the bone. And so if you keep adding more and more, layers to the shaft of the bone, it's going to get wider, right? Well, that's not the only way that a bone grows. A bone also, here's appositional, a bone also grows interstitially, and that's I-N-T-E-R, stitial, interstitial growth. And interstitial growth is when it lengthens from the inside. It grows from the inside out. And that takes place here in the growth plates when you're an adolescent, especially when you hit a growth spurt when you're a teenager. These growth plates go nuts, and they get longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. And the longer that they get, the longer it makes this shaft, the longer it makes this diaphysis get longer and longer in both directions. And so when you stop growing when you're in your 20s, it sort of seals over and it doesn't do that anymore because you don't get any taller after you're 20 something usually, and it turns from an epiphyseal plate into an epiphyseal line because all you can see is the line left over from where the plate used to be. Now in our next video, we're going to go take a look at this bone microscopically, and we're going to look at it at a cellular level, and we're going to see how all the cells work together and form these awesome bones that we have. Oh, but I did promise a really crazy, creepy picture of inside of your spongy bone because it looks really crazy. So this is a trigger warning for anybody who has tryptophobia. So here is the inside of a bone, and as you can see up here is the end of the bone, the epiphyses. Here's an end of a bone down here, an epiphyses, and this is all spongy in here. And this is what it looks like in a micrograph. This spongy, very porous surface. Doesn't that look creepy? I think it looks creepy. But the spongy, porous surface, and in these hollow sections, in these pores, where there just seems to be air in there, normally we would have red bone marrow in there. Red bone marrow between the spongy formation. And the spongy formation technically is called the trabecula. And you might hear that word again in anatomy for some other things that look really similar. But the trabecula, I'll write it over here, trabeculae, or trabeculae, some people might pronounce it, trabeculae. The trabeculae, that is this exact picture, all of these porous surfaces that looks like a close-up of a sponge with holes in it. This is the trabeculae, these formations here. and in where the holes are, where it looks like there are holes right now, the porous surfaces in between the trabeculae, that's where your red bone marrow would be. So next video we're going to look at it up close and see the actual cells of the bones, and we're going to go into how a bone is actually made, how the cells actually make the bone itself.
There's no bone connected to you, but